All right, so we're going to look at creating some 3D lights, and we're going to start off from scratch with some text. And this text is now going to be used as kind of an object that's going to cast shadows onto another surface. So this hasn't been altered, so it is in its original position. It's also not a 3D layer, so that's one of the first things that we'll do is we'll switch that to 3D, and you'll see now that it has all of the properties that we need. And you'll also notice that it has a new set of options here called material options, and this is where we decide whether or not we wanted to cast shadows, whether or not we wanted to accept lights, accept shadows, and all of the things that have to do with the surface, the way that it catches light, and also the way that it transmits light from behind, much like stained glass would. So we'll close that for the moment and we'll come back to it, and we're going to create some sort of a surface that can receive the shadows. So good old solid is usually the first port to call, and that solid is going to be white, and it's going to be called shadow. Now, so just click that, it goes on front. Now it's behind, but we still can't see it because it is, of course, the same color as the text. So just for the moment, I'm going to change the color of the text to a slightly darker gray, just so we can see that. We can change that back at any time then. Right, so we have our text and we have our shadow. We make our shadow 3D also because we need a light to interact with these objects, both of them, and for them to interact with each other in the 3D space. Right, so I'm working in 3D, so I'm going to get my views open, two views horizontal. I'll just zoom out a little bit there, and you can see that they're both flush with each other in Z space because they haven't been moved. This is my active camera. This is going to show me what gets rendered, and I can now start just playing around with the relative position of my light text and my shadow solid. So what I might do is just first of all create a light, and I'm going to call that casts shadow, and I'm going to leave the color, all of that pretty much at their default, and I can come back and change those afterwards. And you can see that that light is now positioned on front of the objects in Z space. I'm looking straight down here and I can see that it is away and on front of. And you can see the light as an object out here as well, and you can see that it's casting a kind of a pool of light onto the text and the solid. So straight away we can see the effect of the light. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to just push this up in on its y-axis so that it goes up, and when we cast a shadow it'll look a little bit like a drop shadow. And we are now going to get our text and just offset that or pull that away from the solid. Okay, so we're just setting up a relationship of light, foreground object, it's going to cast a shadow onto our background object. Okay, so we need to set up a few things here. We need to go into our light and make sure that it casts shadows. That's usually set on by default, but if you have a previous light that you had deselected that, it might pick up the most recent setting. So make sure that that is on. We're going to make sure that it's still on point light. That's the most common one that you're going to use for this kind of an effect. Click OK. We go to our 3D lights. We go down to our material options. We go cast shadows on. Now, straight away off the bat, we now have our light doing something. You can see the shadow on the solid. So we have other settings in the solid itself. In the material options, such as cast shadows, we don't need that because it's not being used to cast a shadow. Light transmission, we don't need that. Accepts lights on and accepts shadows on. So things that we could change here. It's quite nice seeing the light kind of creating this fall off effect where it's kind of brighter in the middle and darker at the edges, because it looks very real and very kind of touchable. But if we wanted to have our background solid, for example, just a flat white that still contains a shadow, then we would change accepts lights from on to off, and now we only have the shadow, and we could do the same if we wanted with our text. So this is a kind of a style thing. Okay, so we can have accepts lights on or off in the sense that they behave or don't behave as if a light is shining on them, but we can still have, even when there's no kind of natural lighting look going on in our text and our solid, we can still have shadows. Once we've got our shadow, we can move the light if we want, or we can move the text. So for example, if we push the text back, we see that the shadow gets a little bit harder because the distance between the object casting and the object receiving the shadow is closer, so we get harder shadows. And you can see that when we move it out towards the light, it goes down and gets softer. Similarly, we could always move the light, and the closer we get, or the higher we get, or even if just by moving the text left to right, you can see that the shadow moves around in a very realistic kind of a way. So that's probably the most simplistic way of using them. And again, remember, we have a light here that has a particular color. Not that that's actually important now, because neither of our objects pick up light, but it also has things like shadow, darkness, and diffusion. So these are ways that you create natural looking shadows. So if you create a shadow diffusion of 0, it kind of just looks like another text layer. If the shadow darkness is at 100, then, you know, again, it doesn't look very shadow-like. So usually these shadows get a nice bit of diffusion, somewhere, you know, 75% and upwards. And the darkness is usually down quite low as well. That might be a bit too low. But this is done by eye, okay? And it depends on the effect that you're going for, and so on. So that shadow, the intention of this shadow is to give a somewhat realistic looking softness. It might be a little bit too dark, so I'll just change that. And you could change the text as well to a different color if it's not, you know, if you want to see the text pop out a little bit more, just change the color. Okay, so that is a very basic introduction into how objects interact with each other when there's a light present in the scene.